Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Daniel. We're continuing to look at Daniel chapter 8, Daniel's second vision. Now, yesterday we focused on the little horn and its persecution against the people of God. Let's continue that, looking again at a few verses that Daniel saw in his vision about this little horn. Verses 11 and following. It, that is the little horn, sets itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It's blasphemous. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord. His sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did. Truth was thrown to the ground. Now, yesterday we identified the little horn of chapter 8 as Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC. We can do this with some certainty because we know that the vision of chapter 8 is dealing with the time of the Greek Empire after it divides into 4 parts. So Antiochus Epiphanes was that Seleucid king in Syria who opposed the people of God, outlawed or tried to outlaw Judaism, banished sacrifices, made Judaism, worship of God, essentially illegal. He did all that in 167 BC. That sparked the Jewish rebellion under the Maccabees. Eventually, the Jews were able to throw off the yoke of Antiochus and drive him out and reestablish worship in the sanctuary. But for that period of time, 3 to 3.5 years, there was intense persecution from Antiochus toward the Jewish people. As I said, Daniel saw this in his prophecy of chapter 8. This was the little horn of chapter 8. We're certain of that. However, you may remember that in chapter 7, we also saw the little horn referred to. But in chapter 7, the little horn comes after the time when the Roman Empire was established, which would be well after the days of Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC. So the little horn of chapter 7 seems to refer to an event that occurs later than the little horn of chapter 8. And then as you read the rest of the book, the little horn comes up a few more times, and it also seems to refer to an event or an incident or perhaps a king after the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Also, when you get to the New Testament, and Jesus is talking about the last times, he talks about some opposition and some persecution, and he references the book of Daniel, and he references some of its allusions to the little horn. And Jesus portrays that as a future event. So how is it that in chapter 8, the little horn can be Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC, and in other places in the book it refers to a future persecutor of the people of God, and even Jesus refers to another little horn that will arise toward the last times. How do we understand all of this? Well, it's interesting that oftentimes the rise of evil repeats itself. Remember yesterday I said that the Antiochus Epiphanes of 167 BC was the Antichrist of the Old Testament. So with Antiochus you have this evil figure rise to persecute and try to destroy the people of God. Well, that is always what Satan tries to do. He engineers the persecution against God's people. In 167 BC he did it with Antiochus. But it's been done at other times throughout history. So what we find in Antiochus of Daniel chapter 8 is one manifestation of that spirit of Antichrist, or that spirit that is anti-God, that tries to destroy the people of God. But that's not the only time in history we will see it. It occurs over and over again. I want to refer you very quickly to a book in the New Testament, the book of 1 John chapter 4. And 1 John chapter 4, John, the author, is talking about the Antichrist that is in the world. He says, when there is a spirit that denies that Jesus is the Christ, that denies who Jesus is, that is the spirit of Antichrist. And then in chapter 4, verse 3, he says, this is the spirit of Antichrist, which you have heard is coming, and even now is already in the world. So when John talked about the spirit of Antichrist, he said there is a future reality of the Antichrist that will come, but also that same spirit of Antichrist is present in the world today. Now, taking all those things in mind, what we have in Antiochus of 167 BC is the spirit of Antichrist. This evil leader arises to persecute the people of God. But that will also occur at other times in history when a leader arises who will exalt himself, who will utter blasphemies, and will persecute the people of God. Oftentimes in church circles, when people speak about the Antichrist, they're thinking of the end times, the second coming, and the opposition of the enemy. And that is true. The Bible talks about that. But what will happen at the end of time is nothing different from what has happened throughout history. You've always had those with the spirit of Antichrist who arose and will arise again to try to destroy the people of God. So when Jesus was talking about the second coming, for instance, in Matthew 24, he referred back to the little horn of Daniel and said, you remember what Daniel said? And what we saw in Antiochus Epiphanes, that will come again in history and will rise to persecute the people of God. And that happens from time to time until the end comes, until Jesus returns. So in Daniel chapter 8, we see the Old Testament Antichrist, Antiochus Epiphanes. But Daniel also refers to others who will arise in the course of history who will carry out the same agenda to try to destroy the people of God. Now, as Daniel saw this vision weighed heavily upon him, and notice how chapter 8 ends in verse 27. He says, I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. So this vision weighed heavily upon Daniel as he saw those times that were to come when God's people would be oppressed. It would be times of tribulation. But of course, Daniel also knew that the end would be the kingdom of God will be established. The spirit of Antichrist will be swept away, and the kingdom of God will come. And that's the hope we live by. Hope you join us next time as we continue our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Daniel. In our next session, we'll start looking at Daniel chapter 9.